I'm Barry Leff. I'm the rabbi here at Temple Beth-El. Haven't seen a crowd like this since Kol Nidre. This is even better than Kol Nidre in terms of the crowd. Now, in planning things, one of the things I didn't plan was having enough light so I could read what I wrote. You get to be my age, it should be a little bit hard to see. But I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Forging Ahead Civil Rights Stories and Song Evening. On behalf of Temple Beth-El, Temple Emanu-El, the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center, and our many sponsors, we're delighted to have you here as part of this evening. We're going to begin our evening with a Havdalah ceremony, which is a ritual that we use to mark the end of the Sabbath, which runs from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. The word Havdalah means separation, as we are separating from the Sabbath. The Sabbath, or Shabbat, as we call it in Hebrew, is intended to be an oasis in time, 25 hours where we try to create as perfect a world as we can, as peaceful a world as we can. And at the end of Shabbat, we're transitioning back to that regular, ordinary, busy world that we normally live in. There's a teaching that says the Messiah will come towards the end of the day on the Sabbath. So if the Messiah didn't come, it means that we've got another week that we've got to get through before the earliest time that the Messiah could come. So as such, we start our Havdalah ceremony with reciting a passage reflecting our confidence that God will redeem us, that we will draw water with joy out of the wells of salvation. The ceremony that we're about to conduct includes 4 blessings. The first blessing can be done on either wine or whiskey. I like whiskey, so we're doing it on whiskey, which has thrown my musicians for a loop because they were ready for wine, and it's a different blessing. But I'm sure they'll be up to the challenge. We use wine or other beverages like that, special beverages, to mark the transition from profane to sacred and from sacred to profane. The second blessing will be on spices. And the reason for the spices, and you've been handed little bags of spices so that you can participate in it when we say this blessing. There's a teaching that says we get an additional soul on the Sabbath, a special Shabbat soul. And when Shabbat ends, that soul leaves. And our regular soul that's left behind feels sad at the departure of that other soul. And the only thing that can comfort a soul, something that's intangible, is something else that's intangible, which is a fragrance. So we have a blessing over spices. And then the third blessing is over fire. We don't kindle fires on Shabbat. So by kindling a fire, we're showing that Shabbat is over and we're making use of the light. And then the last blessing is the blessing of Havdalah, the blessing of separation, separation between the holy and the profane, between light and dark, Israel and the nations, between the 7th day, Shabbat, and the 6 days of creation. And we then sing a song wishing all of us a good week, and we go right into a song about Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, who's supposed to herald the coming of the Messiah, asking that he come speedily in our time with the Messiah, the son of David. The words for some of the blessings are in your handouts, although you got the wrong words for the whiskey blessing. But you will follow along.
Anybody want to throw a coat over this?
Of the projector?
Shabtamayim, Isason, Imanei, Ayeshua, Adonai, Ayeshua.
Ben Kodesh Lecho, Ben Or
להבדיל בין קודש לחול, חטאותינו הוא ימחול. זרענו וכספנו ירבה כחול, וככוכבים בלילה. שבוע טוב, 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 שבוע טוב. A good week, a week of peace, may gladness reign and joy increase. A good week, a week of peace, may gladness reign and joy increase. Eliyahu Hanavi,
Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi,
Bimheira b'yameinu, Yavo Eleinu, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David, Eliyahu Hanavi,
Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu,
Eliyahu Hagiladi.
Shavua Tov, which means have a good week. And if everybody could kind of squeeze in towards the center a little bit, if we have a few latecomers, it'll make it easier for them to find a seat. Thank you.
Shalom, and good evening, everybody. I'm so glad we have light so I can see my notes. What a wonderful crowd we have here tonight. My name is Ronald Levitt, and I represent the combined efforts of Temple Emanu-El, Temple Beth-El, and the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center in bringing you Night 2 of Forging Ahead, Civil Rights, Stories, and Song. I think this is a wonderful and important night in that it deserves a Shehechianu prayer for this special occasion. So please join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shehechianu v'ki imanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has given us life, sustained us, and allowed us to reach this special day. You know what, Rabbi Leff and Rabbi Cohn? This weekend shows that we don't have to wait until the high holy days to fill the sanctuary. It's not all about the shofar. All we have to do to fill up our beautiful and historic sanctuaries is to plan great programs. So on behalf of our planning committee, that was a joke kind of, so. On behalf of our planning committee, welcome to Temple Beth-El for the second day of our two-day journey in which we will learn about and remember what happened in Birmingham as it struggles and still struggles with prejudice and bigotry, and the many changes that have resulted from that struggle. The period of time that we will be studying this weekend includes poignant events that impacted our Jewish community specifically, and were part of a tide of events that profoundly impacts Birmingham, our country, and its citizens, be they black or white, Jew or Gentile, man or woman. Our goal for this weekend was to bring educational and faith communities together to study civil rights stories from Birmingham's past with a special focus on Jewish involvement. There are many stories to tell and many lessons to learn. So you might ask, what was the catalyst for the planning of the weekend? The reasons would include the current social and political atmosphere in which we are living, an opportunity to acknowledge the strides made to make Birmingham a better place for all people, as well as to remember the shockingly true story of how evil men 60 years ago sought to harm our community through the planting of a bomb containing 54 sticks of dynamite next to our beloved Temple Beth-El, as well as the other heinous actions that were used to attack others in our society. Last night, we listened to author T.K. Thorne, Ellen Cooper Erdrich, and Saul Kimberling fill our heads with their words and memories of how the playing out of the civil rights movement in Birmingham and beyond impacted them and their families. We also heard how many of the men and women in that era about the men and women of that era who had an impact on and were impacted by those events of those days, including stories of many familiar and beloved names, most of whom are no longer with us. As a personal note, it is wonderful to see Temple Beth-El and Temple Emanu-El last night coming together as one in prayer and song. Last night was thought-provoking, inspiring, and simply beautiful. If you were here down the street last night at the other end of Highland Avenue, you would have experienced that. So while the world since 1958 has changed, the study of the historical events that happened during the civil rights era sounds a different kind of blast from the blast heard when a bomb explodes. The study of these events can be like a shofar blast, appealing to us, our children, and our grandchildren to heed the call by continuing the holy work of making our community a better place for every man and woman. We are blessed tonight to hear welcoming comments from the first elected African-American mayor of the great city of Birmingham. We will then hear from the gentleman we are proud to call our current mayor and who represents a bright future for our city. We will then be enthralled by important public servants who will closely examine the tragedy of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and their efforts to bring the perpetrators to justice. We will hear about how justice was sought and how civil rights should be protected. This is a story I can't wait to hear. And later tonight, we will celebrate the struggle with song. Neshama Kalbach and her music will be a real treat. Planning for this weekend took months, and it was truly a collaborative effort. I can't tell you how nice it was for the three main organizations that came together, Emanu-El, Beth-El, and the Holocaust Center, to come together for this weekend. I pray this is the first of many steps that we continue to take together. The members of our planning committee are listed in your program, and I want to thank them for all their efforts. As we conceptualized and planned this weekend, it was magical. Everybody that we talked to said yes. The presenters, the donors, the planners, the volunteers, and the attendees. That tells me something powerful. I was tickled that tonight's program sold out during the halftime of the Alabama game on Monday. I got an email from Bob at the halftime, and I figured people had just lost heart. But let me acknowledge the financial contributions made by many organizations and foundations. First of all, the Birmingham Jewish Federation was our initial gift. We went to them, told them what we wanted to do. We didn't have specifics, not that many. Certainly, they didn't all pan out what we wanted to do originally. But they said yes because they saw the power in the concept. The Grafman Endowment Fund for Temple Emanu-El through the Steiner Interfaith Fund and the Joan and Milton Jacobson Cultural Arts Fund, and through the Temple Beth-El Foundation, through the Suzanne and Howard Bierman Adult Education Fund, make terrific financial contributions that help us make this weekend happen. The Birmingham Holocaust Education Center was our partner financially and otherwise. The Rita C. Kimmerling Family Fund and Saul's participation last night were just terrific, and we couldn't have done it without it. Southern Jewish Life magazine, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute was right there with us. This is kind of cool. Both the Men's Club and the Sisterhood of Temple Beth-El and the Sisterhood and Brotherhood of Temple Emanu-El all participated. And finally, and I'm pleased to say that my law firm, Sorority and Permit, made a contribution. What was neat about the way we did it is we had individual gifts from about 70 of our staff and a bunch of our lawyers and our firm, because this is part of our culture and we wanted to support this, and it just makes me very proud to be a part. I also want to recognize the committed support staff and other organizations who work to make the program a success, and a special thanks to all our volunteers, listed and unlisted, who are helping us forge ahead. So now we begin. To begin our evening, I would like to call forward a man who has been a public figure and leader for as long as I can remember, and I'm not that young. Mayor Arrington served 4 terms as the first African-American mayor of the great city of Birmingham, serving as mayor from 1979 through 1999 after serving 4 years on the city council. Important changes for good took place while he was mayor. It seems like when I was growing up, he was always mayor. Mayor Arrington is an accomplished academician with degrees. He's got more degrees than anybody I know. from Miles College to the University of Detroit, a PhD from the University of Oklahoma, and he's done postdoctorate work at Harvard University and the University of Michigan. He has numerous honors and recognitions, including being named as one of the top 5 mayors in the United States in 1987. He was listed in Ebony magazine as one of the 100 most influential black Americans during the 1980 through 2000 era, and he was the first recipient of the National Alpha Phi Alpha Thurgood Marshall Award. On top of that, he's a member of the Deacons Board of Crumbly Beth-El Primitive Baptist Church in Fairfield, and he's got 7 kids. And that's, please give Mayor Richard Arrington a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ron promised me he wouldn't read all of those facts, but he did it anyway. And I thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, or maybe I should use a salutation, my brothers and sisters, because that resonates with me tonight. I thank you, first of all, for the very warm welcome that you've given us tonight. I thank you for this program. I thank you for what you've done in this community over the years. I have lived in this community for 80 years, and I have witnessed the growth of this community, socially, economically, and politically. And it makes me very proud to be a member of this community. I know that coming here tonight, we have some thoughts about the midnight years. We talk about 60 years ago what the news would have been in Birmingham, Alabama. The bombing here, the bombings throughout the city. But there has been an amazing transformation in this community. And I think it is very important that we all remember that and we appreciate that. I remember how sad we were back in those days. I remember the deafening silence of the good people of this community. And I know today that this is in many ways a different community. And I thank you for what you have done. Let me close out by saying what we have seen as we have lived in this community are new generations being birthed here, new and courageous leadership in all aspects of community life. It makes this community a better place for all of us. I remember some of the changes, and there is not time, or this is not the place to talk about it in this community, what happened. But I remember when following the midnight years that I mentioned, I remember that a young Alabamian, a native of Alabama, stepped forward, provided some courageous leadership. I remember a young man stepping forward, a state attorney general, integrating his staff of lawyers, having the political courage to go after the hate mongers. What a turning point that was. I think we think about our community and we look at it politically, and I think other people understand that the people we elect say a whole lot about who we are and what we believe. And what we did a few weeks ago with another courageous public servant, a young Alabamian, is something that we all are so proud of. Thank you. I say this and I take my seat. I've gone 2 minutes over the time I was given already. But I do remember coming here. I mean, this was such a warm reception walking in here tonight. I mean, I have to say that. But I remember in 1980, I made my first trip to Israel, and the Jewish community sponsored that trip. And I remember many things about it. I oftentimes talk about it, but I just want to say this. I met the mayor of Jerusalem. I don't know how many of you remember it. Teddy Kolik was the mayor of Jerusalem. And he said, I said I was mayor of Birmingham when we were introduced. And he said to me, well, Mayor, I will pray for Birmingham, and you pray for Jerusalem. That's the spirit we have here tonight. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Mayor Arrington. I can't tell you what an honor it is to introduce Mayor Randall Woodfin tonight. My husband Maury and I have been big Randall fans ever since his run for the school board in 2013. Mayor Woodfin is a true native son of Birmingham.
He about him. But tonight it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our featured speakers, Doug Jones and Bill Baxley. And they're going to talk about a different space, the courtroom space. And the courtroom space was so important to the civil rights movement. So were sanctuaries. But the courtroom spaces were so absolutely critical to everything. And I'm just going to read to you, I promise, just a few paragraphs that I wrote for a series that Saul Kimmerling and I did several years ago in tribute to the Birmingham Civil Rights Movement. And then I'm going to turn it over to our featured speakers. Before there were preachers, there were lawyers, lots of lawyers, black lawyers, white lawyers, Jewish lawyers, women lawyers, lawyers trained in Dixie, mostly. Lawyers from historically black colleges and universities, many of them, and lawyers with Ivy League pedigrees. Before the preachers became the acknowledged spokesman for the movement, there were already lawyers on the ground chipping away at Jim Crow. Without them, Birmingham would not have become the civil rights movement's nerve center. Nevertheless, they generally receive second and third billing behind spellbinding preachers, notably Martin Luther King and Fred Shuttlesworth, and behind bigots, chiefly Bull Connor and the Ku Klux Klan. They also take a backseat to politicians like Governor George Wallace and President John F. Kennedy, who could not have performed without them. Historians have slighted them too, sometimes, being drawn instead to the swagger and the glitz of the rest. On May the 4th of 2013, the Birmingham Bar Association and the Magic City Bar Association tried to set the record straight when they honored lawyers who played a significant role in the Birmingham movement. They threw them and their families a beautiful gala and rolled out an excellent documentary called Preserving Justice. The keynote speaker that night and a recipient was Clarence B. Jones, the iconic Martin Luther King confidant and speechwriter who helped get the letter from the Birmingham jail to press. Jones that night made emotional remarks about the city he saw in 2013, which he said looked nothing like the one he left in 1963. Anyone could tell that night that he was amazed, caught off guard by what Birmingham had become. He credited, quote, good people, good lawyers, black and white, for the transformation. Jones had the luxury of the historian's perspective, and he offered it. He generously recognized that not one of those attorneys could have untangled segregation by himself or herself. All of their efforts required collaboration, and on some level, between the races and across religious and gender barriers. What he did not say, but likely understood, was that there were additional stories mostly about women, perhaps, that still have not been told. There were 28 honorees that night. Most of them were from Birmingham. Many of them had gone to historically black colleges. Most of them had gotten their degrees in Dixie from the University of Alabama and other places, from Talladega College. Many of them had gotten their law degrees from the University of Alabama. The civil rights movement, as it unfolded in Alabama and especially Birmingham, could not have done that without the efforts and the successes of those lawyers. Those lawyers represented the establishment, not the one that was, but the one they imagined. They did not march in the streets, seek cameras, or inspire the masses. But without their successes, the protests and the bloodshed would not have mattered, and the dream of equality would have stayed a nightmare. Birmingham is proud to be proud. Birmingham is right to be proud of its civil rights history. It is the nerve center of the civil rights movement. And the most tragic incident of the whole period, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, was finally prosecuted. The bombers were prosecuted finally and successfully by Mr. Bill Baxley and Mr. Doug Jones. Like so many other of the lawyers during that period, they did not have to do it, but they felt they needed to. They did it against a lot of odds, and they succeeded. Tonight, it's my very great pleasure to introduce these two men. Bill Baxley, I'm sure they don't need any introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Bill Baxley was Attorney General of the state of Alabama from 1971 to 1979. He later became Lieutenant Governor. Doug Jones was a federal prosecutor and became the prosecutor of the Northern District of Alabama. I also wanted to thank Mayor Woodfin and Mayor Arrington for their wonderful contributions, and anytime I got to vote for any of them, I did. Tonight, Mr. Baxley is going to begin, then he's going to turn it over to, tonight, Senator Jones is going to begin. He is going to hand it over to Mr. Baxley, who will then hand it back to Senator Jones to finish. Thank you very much.
In the back?
Oh, well, thank you. It is awesome to be here. Thank you. I have, in the spirit of this weekend, I tell you I've been forging ahead the last couple of weeks. I want to mention one thing, and I just to blend a little bit of politics and religion as if you hadn't heard enough of that over the last 8 months. I want to remind everybody, because I have so many friends here, so many supporters who gave their time, their money, their heart. Remember that the election of December 12th was the first night of Hanukkah. So as a Democrat from the state of Alabama, you are truly looking at a Hanukkah miracle right here. All right, thank you. All right, but tonight is about Birmingham and history and justice. and doing the right thing and seeking that truth after so many years. And so tonight, the way Bill and I, we've done this all over the country for a number of different groups. The way we do this, I'm going to give a kind of a background about Birmingham and the history to kind of set the stage of what happened. And then I'll turn that over to Bill to talk about his case that he tried in 1977 involving a defendant named Robert Chambliss. So we do it in three parts. He'll turn it back to me to talk about the Tommy Blanton case and the Cherry case. Now this, folks, I will tell you, this takes a little bit of time. Neither one of us, we are lawyers, so we're kind of like preachers. We talk. So if you need to take a, I'm serious, this is about a 90-minute program or so, just the three of us. So if you need to take a break, feel free, get up, move around. Bill and I are both married. We've raised kids. We're used to people walking out on us in the middle of our talk. So feel free. I'm serious though, this will be a while. But let me begin, because and I know I've got lawyers in this room. Lawyers always try to get their cases to a point where they tell a story. A trial is theater. A trial is drama. A trial has to put pieces of a puzzle together for 12 men and women that are sitting on a jury. And in doing that, you have to always go back. And that's what we did when I became the United States Attorney in 1997. And this case had been reopened. And I needed to pull this together, so I read history as well as pulling this case file to try to figure out. We know what was going on, and we know that the Klan was active. But the question was, why was the 16th Street Baptist Church targeted for this bomb on that particular occasion? What was going on in Birmingham? How were things happening at the time? And we did a lot of jury work, and I pulled together to try to learn a little bit of that, of the history, to learn the motives. And we looked at a lot of the juries, and we did some focus groups, and we found out a lot of things. One of the first things we found out is that, and you can appreciate this in this house of worship, that right here in the South, the church, the 16th Street Baptist Church, was as much of a victim as the children who died or those that were injured. We have a special affinity in the South for our houses of worship. And that came through in our focus groups. And so tonight, as we start, I start with 16th Street Baptist Church, because it is exhibit number one. It is the victim. It is the first victim of that horrific bombing. But we also needed to go back, and we needed to look. And the church today, as many of you have been down there, you'll know, is very much like it was in 1963. This is an older picture of the church, and it's almost identical on the outside, except for the very bottom right. And you'll not be able to see it from out in the audience, but there's some concrete steps on that bottom right corner that led to the back of the sanctuary. And those steps haven't been there since the early morning hours of September 15th, about 10:20, when a bomb exploded that had been placed under the very bottom step. But we had to go back even further to look to see, why was this church targeted? What was going on in Birmingham? And so I looked back, and if we put our case together, we went all the way back and looked at a lot of the civil rights history. But in particular, we looked at the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. That's the decision in which the Supreme Court of the United States got rid of over 100 years of precedent. Up until that point, the doctrine of separate but equal. You could have separate schools for black kids and white kids as long as they were equal. Well, they weren't equal in the South, and everybody knows that. But in 1954, this decision changed all that. And the court said schools that are separate are inherently unequal, and schools should desegregate with all deliberate speed. Well, that didn't happen. It didn't happen in the South. It didn't happen around the country. But what did happen was that people tried. And it took a lot of great lawyering, and it took a lot of brave people. And in 1957, one of the great leaders from here in Birmingham, Fred Shuttlesworth, decided he was going to test this ruling and try to enroll his children in an all-white school here in Birmingham. So in the fall of 1957, Fred and his wife rolled up to Birmingham, up in Phillips High School. It's now Phillips Academy. You know, it's downtown, and one of the most prominent white schools in the state of Alabama at the time. And there was a mob of people waiting on him, all white folks. There happened to be a young man that morning who had just graduated from Phillips, and it was going to go to UAB and needed to get his transcript. And he went back to get his transcript, and he saw what was going on. Well, this young man was working at our local PBS station. And he had an old camera, an 8mm movie camera. And he saw what was happening. As a budding newsman, he thought, I better capture this. And he caught on film what happened with Fred Shuttlesworth rolled up in front of Phillips High School that morning, simply to enroll his daughters. Now, I'm going to try to play this. I'm going to stop it a minute because I hope I can stop it the right way, to try to show you a couple of points. All right, for those of you who can see up here, what you'll see over here to the left is Reverend Shuttlesworth and his wife. You'll see him getting beaten, kicked, and chased up and down the road, sidewalk. And then this man right here in this white shirt, he'll reach in his pocket and pull out something out of his pocket to get back into the fight. There he goes. Now, before I tell you a little bit about the man in the white shirt, I want you to just think about what you saw. Here was a man of faith, a preacher, a Baptist minister, who was trying to get his children a better education, and that's the mob he was met with. Making a point for sure, but at the end of the day, trying to get his children and others that were like his children a better education. But the mob met with him because they could not stand to see black kids and white kids going to school together. And the first piece of the puzzle for my prosecution comes together involving school desegregation. Now, the other part of that video that I showed you, the man in the white shirt, didn't have any children at that school, but felt compelled to violence to try to stop the school integration. That man was Bobby Frank Cherry, who I would prosecute years, over 50, 40 years later. I had no kids there, but felt compelled to violence. And so now a piece of that puzzle that I was telling you about for our cases come into play. Now, over the next 6 years after Fred Shuttlesworth decided to do that, now Fred was brave, but he wasn't real dumb, so he didn't try that again. They filed a lawsuit, and it was great lawyering that took that lawsuit over the course of the next 6 years. And in the meantime, what was happening in Birmingham and elsewhere is the civil rights movement was growing. It was growing every day, and the Klan did not know how to take it. The Klan violence was the same. As the civil rights movement grew, so did Klan violence. It's the only way to try to stop it. In 1961, the Freedom Riders came through Birmingham. Their bus had been bombed in Anniston, Alabama, firebombed. People almost died there. They came on into Birmingham. And on Mother's Day in May of 1961, Freedom Riders pulled into the Greyhound bus station, and there was not a police officer in sight. And the melee that ensued was caught on film. This is what happened to those Freedom Riders, young men and women, black and white, traveling from Washington, D.C. through the South to integrate the interstate transportation facilities. And this is what happened. And by the way, the person that belongs to this really large butt that you see in front right there, it happened to be a FBI informant, Gary Thomas Rowe, one of the most famous informants. But what happened that day is that Bull Connor, who was controlling the police department and the fire department, had kept his police officers away for 20 minutes with a deal with the Klan. We all know that now. When asked why he didn't have any police officers there when everybody knew where he was coming, he said, they were all visiting their mothers. It was Mother's Day. But he kept them away to inflict the damage. John Lewis, Congressman Lewis, was a part of that group, as was others. Now, over the next couple of years, what was really started to change, when those pictures got flashed around the world, business leaders in Alabama, those people that Dr. Arrington had talked about, or Ron had talked about, that when good men did not say enough, they started to quietly come and change Birmingham's form of government. There's a group of business leaders in Japan at a Rotary Club, and when they saw the reaction of their colleagues from around the world about the horror that they had seen out of Birmingham, they knew that changes had to come, or else their businesses would dry up. They were not friends of the civil rights movement, but they didn't want Birmingham to die. And so they came back and they quietly set about to try to change the form of government in Birmingham and go from a 3-member commission in which Bull Connor had the police and fire to a mayor and city council. And in the fall of 1962, the citizens of Birmingham voted overwhelmingly to change the form of government in Birmingham and go to a mayor and city council. So the campaign began and elections were set. At the same time, Reverend Shuttlesworth was over in Atlanta trying to convince Dr. King to come to Birmingham to desegregate the city, that Dr. King had called the most segregated city in America, Birmingham, Alabama. And there was just one problem. Bull Connor was running for mayor. And if the marches came over to Birmingham in the spring during that campaign, guess who was going to probably get elected? So they postponed those marches for a bit. Bull Connor's in a runoff, so they postponed them again. And finally, Bull Connor is defeated. Albert Boutwell is elected as Birmingham's first mayor in a new form of government. He can't take office, and Connor and his guys are still there. But now change is in the air. But that's when the leaders of the movement decided it was time to come to Birmingham. And they came to Birmingham, and Dr. King went to jail, and you know he wrote the famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which I think should be read by every school child in America because it's a remarkable piece of work. When he was released, the movement was still faltering a little bit in Birmingham. So they had the idea that in order to make things happen, they would get the children involved, the kids of Birmingham. The Birmingham March, which was known initially as Project C for Project Confrontation, became known as the Children's Crusade. And it was the children of Birmingham that would gather at the 16th Street Baptist Church. That's where the meetings were held. The disc jockeys of the day, Tall Paul White and Shelley the Playboy Stewart, would give the signals of the kids, and they would empty out of the schools and everywhere and come downtown and go to 16th Street where they gather in the sanctuary to plan the day, a very peaceful march, only to City Hall to march for freedom. But as you all know what happened, they got no farther than the intersection where the fire hoses and the dogs were sicked on them by Bull Connor. It's a photograph, and you've seen all of these, but that's the church in the background. I show these because of the proximity. This is not long marches. This is right across the street from the 16th Street. You can see that at one point Bull Connor had a water tank that he painted white. Now that water tank, I guarantee you, never rumbled through the white neighborhoods of Birmingham. But it did that day to keep people in their place. The dogs you can see with the church just there in the background, just in the intersection, just outside of the 16th Street Baptist Church. This is the famous photograph that President Kennedy saw on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times that said it made him physically sick and decided that he would start to work on a Civil Rights Act. The fire hoses and the dogs did not deter these kids, so they started arresting them. Thousands of children arrested, so many that the Birmingham jail filled up, and they had to make a makeshift jail at the State Fairgrounds, Fair Park, where the State Fair used to meet every year. Now, what was also going on, though, is that those business leaders who had changed the form of government, and now we're seeing all of the bad things about Birmingham on the front page again. All of a sudden, Birmingham was back in the spotlight, and not in a good way. And they're thinking, what can we do? So they started to meet secretly with Dr. King again to try to figure out a way to end those marches. As they met with Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth, and they forged a very modest settlement to end the marches. This is a photograph of Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth and Reverend Abernathy announcing at the press conference at the A.G. Gaston Motel a very modest settlement. And by the way, for those of you who know, the fellow up here in the corner who I've kind of cropped out this photograph, he's wearing his overalls, was a very young Ambassador Andrew Young, one of Dr. King's aides who was here during the whole time. And so they forged this very modest settlement in the marches. It took down white and colored signs from the lunch counters by law they were supposed to have been down anyway, but Birmingham's Jim Crow laws were still in force. Connor made sure that all the Jim Crow laws were still in force. Laws like that it's a crime punishable by a time in the city jail if a black man and a white man were caught playing checkers together in public. That was not only on the books, it was still enforced. If you could ever find a black man who would sit down to play checkers in public with a white man. But it did away with all of those laws and moved it in Birmingham in a different direction. It changed, took down the white and colored signs. The ladies who ran the elevators and the department stores were able to get on the sales floor as clerks, and that was a really big event. It did not require the city to hire black police officers. That didn't come for several years. But even with that modest settlement, the Klan was pretty unhappy. It's a photograph of Robert Shelton from Tuscaloosa. Shelton was the head, the Grand Cyclops or Super Dragon person. I forget what they had these names and titles that he said that night on television that modest settlement would be Dr. King's epitaph. And sure enough, that night, a bomb exploded at the A.G. Gaston Motel where Dr. King had been staying. Fortunately, he had left and no one was injured. But the die was cast, and now more pieces of the puzzle for the prosecutors that would come years later fallen into place. First, the first most obvious is that now all of a sudden, it wasn't just Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth and Reverend Abernathy who were the symbols of the movement. It was 16th Street Baptist Church and the children of Birmingham. And when you became a symbol of the movement in Birmingham, you may as well put a bullseye on your chest and on your back, because the second piece of the puzzle was the Klan was even more unhappy. And so the combination of those ultimately proved deadly. But the Klan was so unhappy that they continued to ramp up the violence. Just 2 weeks after that modest settlement, Reverend A.D. King, the brother of Martin Luther King, who was preaching here in Birmingham, his home was bombed. It was not long after that, in early June, that George Wallace stood at the stand in the schoolhouse door, blocked two kids, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from enrolling at the university. Well, it was temporary. If you know your history about that, you know it was all staged. It was all done. It was just to feather Wallace's cap to help his political career. Wallace was never going to block those two kids from enrolling in the University of Alabama, but they didn't know that. The Klan didn't know it. There were armed Klansmen around Tuscaloosa waiting for the race war to happen. Race war, a term that we heard again just a few short years ago when Dylan Roof went into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed 9 people with a gun. History does have a tendency of repeating itself if we're not very careful. But that's what was happening that day, and when he stepped aside, the Klan was pretty unhappy. Now, for those that don't know, a little piece of trivia. Vivian Malone was from Mobile. Her sister is a physician in Washington, D.C. She's been a friend of mine for a number of years. She's Sharon Malone Holder, married to Eric Holder, the first African American. And I'm proud to say both Eric and Sharon were at my swearing in 2 weeks ago. So now the die was cast again. More things happened. Medgar Evers was murdered that same night, I believe, or the next night in June. The violence was continuing. Across the summer, there was more bombings. Birmingham had seen so many bombings, but that summer they saw more. Arthur Shores, who was one of the great leaders, one of the great lawyers that Pam talked about, his home was bombed twice. You know, Arthur Shores later became the first African American on the Birmingham City Council. His home was bombed twice. This is the photograph of the second bombing in August of 1963. Also in August, you had the I Have a Dream speech. 300,000 people or so on the mall in Washington, D.C., and hope is truly alive. But in Birmingham, Alabama, it was a different story. Because in Birmingham, that lawsuit that was filed to desegregate the city schools of Birmingham had now wound its course. And in August, the federal courts in Birmingham had ordered that Birmingham city schools desegregate for the first time. Now, we're not talking about closing schools or busing children or anything like that. We're talking about a handful of black kids who were going to go to what had been an all-white school. But even with that, going back to all the racial violence over school desegregation, Birmingham was not immune. And even with that very modest desegregation order, this was what was going on outside all the white schools. The boycotts, the Confederate flags. And I've been giving this talk for a long time now. It's 16, 17 years, and Bill and I have been doing it. And every time, even back then, before Dillon Roof, before Charlottesville, I always talked about that Confederate battle flag. And if you ever understand that the Confederate battle flag is a symbol of hate and not a symbol of history, look here. That's not a history class. And then a few months ago, when a friend who's helping me write a book, I was showing him some things, and I came across this old newspaper. It's called the Thunderbolt. This is a racist newspaper that the National States Rights Party put out. And it's horrible, the stuff that's in here about blacks, Catholics, Jews. It's unbelievable. And on the back, we were looking at it, and on the back, I saw this advertisement. And I want y'all to hear this. Because if you ever have friends who talk about this is history, this is our heritage, tell them to call me. Because I can show them this in 1965 where the National States Rights Party wants you to buy Confederate battle flags from them, and it says fly the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag is no longer a sectional emblem. It is now the symbol of the white race and white supremacy. As lawyers say, I rest my case. So I don't think it's a coincidence that just 5 days before this bombing, the schools of Birmingham are desegregated, and these two young men, Dwight and Floyd Armstrong, walk into Graymont Elementary School. All of a sudden now, Birmingham will never be the same. And Birmingham was like a powder keg simply because of school desegregation. That is their dad, James Armstrong, one of the great leaders of the movement, a foot soldier who carried the flag in the Selma to Montgomery March. You see Reverend Shuttlesworth at the beginning, and the man with a hat on toward the end over there on the left is Oscar Adams, one of the great lawyers that we had here. Oscar Adams later became the first African American on the Alabama Supreme Court and actually won, for those of you old enough to remember, a statewide election in the 1980s to the Alabama Supreme Court. But when those kids, can you imagine the hate that they had to endure, the profanities, the spitballs? So now, 5 days later, on Sunday, September 15th, it was going to be a youth worship service. The youth of Birmingham, the targets of the movement, the symbols of the movement, and the church, another symbol of the movement, were coming together again, not because of civil rights, but because of faith, to do what Christians do on a Sunday morning and worship. And it was the children who were going to lead. It was going to be a youth worship service, the first of a series that Reverend John Cross wanted to do that day. He was going to do it monthly because the kids in Birmingham had a tough time. And with some of the participants gathered in the ladies' lounge in the basement. This is Addie Mae Collins. She was 14 years old. It's an older picture of Addie Mae. Came to Sunday school and church that morning with her sisters, having a great time. Met up with Cynthia Morris Wesley, who was living with the Wesley family, going to Sunday school and church at the 16th Street Baptist Church. Met in the ladies' lounge along with Carol Denise McNair, the daughter of Chris and Maxine McNair. Denise was the youngest. She was 11, almost 12 years old at the time. And I picked this photograph. I used many of the photographs that you're seeing here in my trials. And I picked this one because Denise's dad, Chris, had been a friend of mine for many years, and Bill's too. And in the movie Four Little Girls, he made a point of saying that this was his favorite picture. Chris, as many of you know, and you know Chris, he was a photographer. He's got some amazing images of the day and of portraits and of African-American life in Birmingham. But this one was taken with Denise's little Instamatic camera, and it was his favorite. And so I picked the favorite picture of a father, of his daughter, not knowing the real meaning. There was so much that continued to gnaw at me throughout both of these trials. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as we conclude the program. And finally, Carol Robertson, the daughter of Miss Alpha Robertson. Carol was a dancer, also 14 years old. And these young ladies just simply gathered in the ladies' lounge to get ready for that 11 o'clock worship service. When that bomb exploded at about 10:22 officially, this clock says 10:24. This clock was across the street at a laundry owned by Denise's grandfather, Mr. Pippin. Time always stands still with events like this. It doesn't matter what it is, and time stood still for Birmingham for so long. It stood still for Alabama. It stood still for America. The bomb was a pretty powerful blast. You can see right here, this was a door. It's a window now. They never replaced the steps, and the steps went right in front of this large window where the ladies' lounge was. The bomb was right there underneath, so you can imagine that the brunt of this bomb went right into the ladies' lounge. All of the windows across the street at the rooming house and the establishments were blown out. Concrete everywhere. The concrete steps destroyed. The church windows on the 16th Street side of the church were destroyed, not only from flying debris, but also the concussion of the blast that bounced off the brick from the other building and hit that way. And this, of course, is the most famous picture from the morning, where the 16th Street stained glass window depicts Christ as the Good Shepherd, and you can see that the most significant damage is the face of Jesus. A significant meaning for the members of that church and for people who still come there today as they see that photograph in the basement. Inside the church, the adult Sunday school classes were meeting because they'd grown so large that they were meeting in the sanctuary that Sunday morning. There were 23, 24 injuries. Fortunately, no one up there was injured too bad, but it destroyed, and there was soot and debris flying through the sanctuary, again destroying the windows. And then these cars on the outside, you can see the damage inflicted on both of the automobiles that were right outside, crumpling this car, and then you can look here and see how the sheet metal of that automobile had just been pierced by the mortars and the bricks that were flying through. This was a pretty powerful blast, folks. It destroyed the concrete steps. And I say it was powerful. We still don't know what it was. They think it was dynamite. For those who have been in Birmingham a long time, you know dynamite was plentiful. There were 2 or 3 dynamite manufacturing facilities in Birmingham, just outside of Birmingham. But we never could. The FBI could never figure out exactly what it was. But we know it was big. We estimated of 15 sticks of dynamite, and that was important in my case because the defense in my case tried to say that the bomb had been thrown from a car. They had found a witness who had seen a station wagon with Confederate battle flags drive by slowly. That car didn't belong to Blanton or Cherry or Chambliss. And it peeled out, and then moments later the bomb exploded. Well, that bomb, and so their theory was the bomb was thrown underneath the bottom step. That bomb was way too big to be thrown, much less just wedged right underneath the bottom step. Destroying those concrete steps, this is the crater where the bomb was placed. It blew through 18 inches of concrete straight into the ladies' lounge where these young women were just getting ready for the worship service. It destroyed the wall, exposing the steps leading up to the sanctuary, and was nothing but rubble. You see the sink over in the ladies' lounge. This was taken shortly after the bodies were removed, and the sink later becomes a part of our story. This case was investigated a lot. I mean, the FBI did a remarkable job. They came in, they hit the ground, but they just couldn't get there. For whatever reason, the Klan, this is the first bombing in Birmingham in which people had died, and the Klan clammed up. They had a lot of informant information, but they could never make the case. And so 5 years later, the case is closed by the federal authorities, the FBI, because it was only a 5-year statute of limitations, and they thought they could never bring it again. But what they didn't know, or what they did know at the time, though, was there were a lot of suspects. The suspects everyone knew about. This is Robert Chambliss, who Bill would prosecute later. He was part of a group of Klansmen who would meet. Their group, by the way, was Eastview 13. Their official Klan group was Eastview 13, and they met at the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge in Eastlake. True story. But there was a splinter group that would meet separately, and Chambliss was kind of the ringleader of that, along with Tommy Blanton, who I would prosecute. This is a photograph of Blanton after he was interviewed in October of '63. This is a photograph of Blanton right before, at a hearing before his trial in 2001. He was part of the group, a real hater, as was Bob Cherry, who you saw on the video. Cherry was a truck driver. This is a photograph of Cherry at his trial in 2002. They would meet down Highway 280 just out of Cahaba Heights, where the Cahaba River is. And there's a bridge. The old bridge there is still there in existence. And these guys, as you head out toward now Target and Best Buy and those places, the old bridge is still there. And these guys would meet literally underneath the bridge like a bunch of trolls. And that's where they would this bomb plot was hatched out. They would just go, they'd leave their other Klan meetings, and that's where they would just go and they'd get liquored up and they'd talk about all the things they were going to do to all the people that didn't look like them or act like them or worship like them. And that's where we had significant evidence that the bomb plot was hatched in the course of the weekend before and the weekend after, as well as the modern sign shop, which is at the time just a few blocks from the church. There was a bustle of Klan activity at the sign shop that weekend, and then we had testimony about that. But unfortunately, despite the fact that there was information that the FBI and others felt pretty confident, they just couldn't have the case. They didn't have the evidence that they could go forward with, so the case was closed. And it wasn't until 1970 that a young district attorney from Houston County is elected as Alabama's Attorney General. In 1970, William J. Baxley, Bill Baxley, is elected as Alabama's Attorney General at the ripe old age of 28 years old. This photograph is actually of Bill when he is 28 or 29. He's not 12. But when Bill Baxley comes into office, he does what needed to be done and takes that case and starts investigating it. And in 1977, prosecutes Dynamite Bob Chambliss for the murder of Denise McNair. And so with that, I want to turn it over to my great friend, Bill Baxley.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank everybody that invited us. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to participate in this, and I'm touched to be invited to be part of it. When we start these programs, since most of them are given out of state, I tell people a little bit about my background, because very few people have roots as far back in Alabama as I do, as my family goes. All of my people on all sides were in Alabama for centuries. The last Baxley that wasn't born in Alabama was born in the 1700s, and he was born in South Carolina. So I got all my education in the segregated schools of Alabama, from the first day of school to the last day of law school, except the last year in law school, we technically had Vivian Malone and James Hood in undergraduate school, so I reckon they say that was an integrated year. But in fact, I never went further north than either Chattanooga or Memphis, whichever one of those was the furthest, till I was 21 years old. So people wonder how I got the ideas that I got and how I got the beliefs that I have, and they want me to tell some story. Those of you that are familiar with some of the Christian stories and doctrine have heard about the miracle, they say, of Saul on the way to Damascus when he became St. Paul. He got this miracle light that let him see the light, so to speak. And people think that there was something similar like that I got some light that I all of a sudden saw with my background, where I felt like I did about race and civil rights. And I said, that would be a good story, but it's not true. I felt like that from the time that I remember, I think, from going to my Sunday school lessons in church, and my parents taught me to treat people fairly, but I always, as long as I remember, thought it was wrong to mistreat people because of the color of their skin or their religion or anything else. And I never recall feeling any different. And as I grew into a teenager and the Montgomery bus boycott started, and it became on the news, and I started getting more and more vocal, and my dad, good man that he was, would still start cautioning me and say, son, you need to watch what you say, because there's nothing you can do about this, and you're just going to ruin yourself. And I got more and more vocal about it as I got to college, and I bet my dad 50 times told me, son, you got to watch what you're saying, because there's absolutely nothing you can do about it, and you're just going to ruin yourself. I'm glad you feel like that, but there's nothing you can do. But as bad as I felt about these things that were happening in the 63 that Doug mentioned about, the Medgar Evers and the stand in the schoolhouse door, which I witnessed from the law school's second floor window, as proud as I was about the march in Washington, I distinctly remember the feelings I had on the day the bomb went off. I was over at my fraternity house getting ready to eat and watch football. That bomb went off. It soon came over the news. There'd been deaths, and then later there were little children. And I remember losing my appetite. I couldn't eat. All that afternoon, I was almost physically ill, like somebody mentioned earlier. That night, I made a vow that I was going to try to do something about that. Now, you've got to understand what I envisioned being able to do at the time I made that little vow to myself. I never dreamed that I'd be Attorney General of Alabama. What I envisioned being able to do was, if the feds arrested somebody, go in and volunteer to the U.S. Attorney's Office to tote Cokes and coffee and hot dogs and cigarettes and law books and write briefs and carry briefcases, or anything they wanted me to do. If I had to even drop out of school to do it, that's what I envisioned being able to do. But I was just starting my senior year in law school, and within 5 years, the statute ran, as Doug mentioned, and J. Edgar Hoover closed the case, and nothing happened. But just a little over 6 years after that bomb went off, I was elected Attorney General of Alabama with a lot of good luck, a lot of being in the right place at the right time, a lot of good help. In fact, I'm going to digress just a minute. Coming down here tonight, I got to thinking about the first time I ever was in the Temple Beth-El. It was almost 50 years ago. And I came in with my dear friend and mentor, Abe Berkowitz, brought me in to try to introduce me around to a men's breakfast they were having, because Abe was already instrumental in helping me plan to run for Attorney General. And with a lot of help like that, other people in this congregation, Carl Friedman was one of them that's been my friend forever, but brought back a lot of memories coming down here is where I'm digressing to. But I got elected Attorney General. Gosh, Doug, take that down. It's too big of a, too big of a contrast. I didn't know that was still up there. But I got, the day before I got sworn in, they had issued me keys to the building, keys to the office, a commission, a badge, and several other things I'd need as Attorney General. And one of the things they issued me, this was before the days of 800 numbers, they issued me this card here. And it was a card, we didn't have 800 numbers, but as you see, all the major cities in Alabama are listed. And if you were in those cities, Birmingham, you could dial that number for Birmingham, and the lady, one of the ladies answering the state switchboard would pick up, and so you'd just say, how about ringing my office, or ringing, or if you were in Birmingham, you'd say, how about hooking me up to such a number in Mobile, and they'd ring that for you. And so I knew I'd be using that card frequently, because I'd be traveling all over Alabama, and you'd be calling it in. So I sat down the night before I was sworn in and wrote in the corners of each card, and then on the number, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And on the back, I wrote the numbers. The number one's faded off from use. I wrote the names of those little girls, because I wanted that. I knew I'd be using that card nearly every week, and I wanted to be reminded that the one goal I wanted to do while I was Attorney General was find out who had killed those children and see if I could do something about it. And so within a week or two, I sent over and got the state troopers' files. A few weeks later, we got copies of the Birmingham police file and Jefferson County Sheriff's file, and we started working on it. And our first suspect, we wasted, not wasted, but we got off on the wrong tangent and went down a couple of wild goose chases. And our first suspect we'd gotten a tip was a guy named J.B. Stoner. That's J.B. right there. He was the head of the National States Rights Party. And J.B., in my opinion, was the most anti-Semitic human being that's ever lived in America. And he did more to spread that awful hatred than anybody else that I know of. But J.B. and his group was our first suspect, and we spent about the better part of a year going after J.B. It turns out that J.B., although he and his group had done a lot of bombings all over the South, he didn't do that bombing. But one that he and his group did, he planted 60 years ago this spring. He planted the bomb here at Temple Beth-El. That was discovered by he and his group planted it, as they said, 54 sticks of dynamite.